She was an invisible maid, quietly scrubbing blood from a mob boss's carpets. But when Dante Santoro followed her into Chicago's darkest slums, expecting to execute a traitor, the shocking secret she funded with her meager pay brought the city's most ruthless, cold-blooded killer to his absolute breaking point. Dante Santoro did not become the head of the Chicago Syndicate by trusting the people around him. At 34 years old, he ruled the city's sprawling underworld with a calculated, terrifying brutality. His fortress was a sprawling, multi-million-dollar stone mansion heavily guarded on Astor Street, nestled in the affluent Gold Coast neighborhood. Behind its towering iron gates, the estate was a sanctuary of dark mahogany, imported Italian marble, and secrets that could put dozens of powerful men in federal prison for consecutive life sentences. In Dante's world, loyalty was a currency more valuable than gold, and betrayal was the only sin punishable by an unmarked grave. Everyone who worked inside the Astor Street mansion was heavily vetted. His enforcers, his drivers, even his private chefs had backgrounds so thoroughly scrubbed by his lieutenants that they were essentially ghosts. But then there was Clara. Clara Hayes was 22. With mousy brown hair, she perpetually kept tied in a tight, unremarkable bun at the nape of her neck. She had been hired 6 months ago through a proxy agency, tightly controlled by Dante's underboss, Leo Rossi. Clara worked the night shift, specifically tasked with cleaning the private east wing of the estate, Dante's personal quarters and his private office. It was a hazard pay position. The night maid often had to scrub away the collateral damage of Dante's violent life. A trail of bloody footprints on the Persian rugs, shattered crystal from a fit of rage, or the lingering scent of gunpowder and expensive bourbon. Clara never complained. She never spoke out of turn. In fact, she rarely spoke at all. When Dante walked into a room, his towering, broad-shouldered frame casting long, intimidating shadows, Clara would simply lower her gaze to the floor, gather her cleaning supplies, and silently melt into the background. She was the perfect, invisible employee. Until Dante began to notice the anomalies. It started with the cash. Dante's household staff was paid generously, directly into offshore accounts to avoid the probing eyes of the IRS. But Clara had specifically requested to be paid in raw, untraceable cash. Every Friday, Leo would hand her a thick manila envelope containing $3,000. It was an astronomical amount for a maid, but hazard pay in the Santoro household came with a premium. Then came the advances. In her 3rd month, Clara approached Leo with trembling hands and asked for a $10,000 advance. She claimed it was for a family emergency, a debt her deceased father had left behind. Dante had authorized it, assuming it was a one-time issue. But 2 months later, she asked for another advance, $5,000 this time. Dante, a man whose survival depended on hypervigilance, felt the cold prickle of suspicion creeping into the back of his mind. Where was a 22-year-old girl funneling thousands of dollars in untraceable cash? His paranoia deepened during a high-stakes sit-down in his private dining room. The heads of the Gallo Syndicate, a rival faction Dante was currently negotiating a fragile truce with, were seated at his table. Clara had been tasked with pouring the wine. As she leaned over Frank Gallo to refill his glass, Dante watched her closely. Her hand didn't shake. Her breathing was steady. But her eyes, usually firmly glued to the floor, flicked upward, locking onto a sensitive architectural blueprint of the Chicago port docks Dante had left unrolled on the side table. It was a micro-expression, a flash of intense calculation that lasted no more than a second. but Dante saw it. That night, after the Gallo crew left, Dante reviewed the security footage. He watched Clara clock out exactly at 11:30 p.m. She didn't wait for the staff transport van. Instead, she walked out into the freezing Chicago rain, pulling her threadbare wool coat tightly around her slim frame, and disappeared down the slick, neon-lit pavement of State Street. "She's a rat," Dante murmured to himself in the dark of his security room, the glowing monitors casting a pale blue light across his scarred, chiseled face. "She's selling information to the gallows, or worse, she's an informant for Detective O'Connor." The thought of an informant sleeping under his roof, walking through his private sanctuary, made his blood run cold. If Clara was wearing a wire, or if she was photocopying his ledgers and handing them to the feds to pay off whatever massive debt she was in, his entire empire was on the verge of a catastrophic collapse. Dante didn't order Leo to take care of it. If Clara was a spy, he needed to know exactly who her handler was. He needed to know where the information was going, and he needed to sever the head of the snake himself. He decided he would shadow her. The next Thursday, the night she received her cash envelope, Dante waited. He wore a heavy black overcoat, a dark, flat cap pulled low over his brow, and carried his customized suppressed H&KUSP pistol tucked into his shoulder holster. At 11:30 p.m., the heavy oak door of the servants' entrance clicked shut. Clara emerged into the bitter, biting wind of the Chicago winter. She clutched her worn leather satchel tightly to her chest, the satchel that Dante knew contained $3,000 of his money. Dante slipped out the side gate, entirely unnoticed by his own perimeter guards. He climbed into the driver's seat of a black, heavily tinted armored Range Rover he kept parked off-site for discreet movements. The engine purred to life with a low, menacing growl. As Clara walked toward the subway station, Dante slipped the SUV into gear, his eyes narrowed into lethal slits. Tonight, he was going to uncover the truth. And before the sun rose over Lake Michigan, Clara Hayes would pay the ultimate price for her betrayal. Tailing a target in a sprawling metropolis like Chicago was an art form, and Dante Santoro was a master of it. He kept the armored Range Rover exactly 1 block behind Clara, tracking her small, huddled figure as she descended into the fluorescent-lit maw of the Clark/Division Red Line station. Dante parked the SUV in a loading zone, uncaring of the consequences, and moved swiftly down the concrete stairs. He paid his fare in cash and slipped onto the platform, just as the southbound train screeched to a halt. The doors slid open, and he watched Clara board the middle car. Dante boarded the car behind hers, positioning himself by the connecting doors where he could observe her through the smudged glass without being seen. Clara sat rigidly on the plastic bench, her knuckles white as she gripped her satchel. She looked terrified. Good, Dante thought. She should be. People who stole from the Santoro family thoroughly lived long enough to spend the money. The train rattled and swayed, leaving the glittering wealth of the downtown loop behind. They passed the South Loop, then Chinatown, plunging deeper into the neglected, forgotten arteries of the city. Finally, the train hissed to a stop at the Garfield station in Washington Park, a gritty, unforgiving neighborhood entirely controlled by the remnants of the Romano crew. A volatile street gang Dante had violently dismantled 3 years ago. Why is she here? Dante's jaw clenched. If she's selling me out to the Romanos, I'll burn this entire neighborhood to the ground. Clara hurried off the train. Dante followed, a silent, deadly shadow stalking her through the biting cold. The streets here were vastly different from Astor Street. Streetlights flickered and buzzed, casting long, erratic shadows over cracked sidewalks and boarded-up storefronts. The air smelled of damp concrete, stale beer, and desperation. Clara moved with practiced urgency, taking a convoluted route. She cut through a narrow, trash-strewn alleyway, doubled back down a side street, and paused at the corner to check over her shoulder. Dante pressed his back against the freezing brick wall of a liquor store, melting completely into the darkness. She was employing rudimentary counter-surveillance tactics. She was definitely hiding something. Finally, Clara arrived at her destination, a dilapidated, 3-story brownstone that looked like it had been abandoned for a decade. The windows were boarded up with rotting plywood, and the front steps were crumbling. But Dante noticed a faint, warm glow seeping through the cracks of a basement window. Clara knocked on the heavy steel door in a specific rhythm. 2 quick taps, a pause, and 3 slow thuds. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a sliver of light, and she slipped inside. Dante waited 60 seconds. He unbuttoned his overcoat, reaching inside to grip the cold, textured handle of his suppressed pistol. He drew the weapon, holding it down by his thigh, and approached the building. The lock on the door was old, but heavily reinforced. However, the side window leading to the basement was secured only by a rusted iron grate. Using his sheer brute strength, Dante gripped the iron bars and pulled. The rusted screws groaned in protest before snapping entirely, pulling the grate free from the crumbling brickwork. Dante pushed the cracked window open and slipped silently into the basement. The air inside smelled intensely of bleach, rubbing alcohol, and something metallic. Blood. He found himself in a narrow, dimly lit corridor. From the room at the end of the hall, he heard voices. Dante raised his weapon, clicking the safety off with a nearly inaudible metallic snick. He moved forward, his rubber-soled boots making absolutely no sound on the linoleum floor. He expected to round the corner and find Frank Gallo, or a corrupted CPD detective, waiting to exchange an envelope of cash for Dante's secrets. He reached the doorframe and peered around the edge, his finger hovering dangerously over the trigger. What he saw paralyzed him. It wasn't a mob boss's hideout. It was a makeshift, underground trauma clinic. The walls were lined with stolen medical supplies, IV drip stands, and oxygen tanks. In the center of the room, standing under a glaring surgical light, was Dr. William Arris, a brilliant, disgraced thoracic surgeon who had lost his medical license years ago and now operated exclusively on the black market, fixing up gunshot victims who couldn't risk going to a hospital. Clara stood across from Dr. Arris. She unzipped her worn leather satchel and began pulling out stacks of $100 bills, slamming them onto a steel surgical tray. "3,000, Dr. Arris," Clara said, her voice shaking, devoid of the quiet submission she showed at the mansion. "Just like we agreed. That covers the antibiotics, the physical therapy equipment, and the dialysis for the next 2 weeks." "You're cutting it close, Clara," Dr. Arris replied gruffly, counting the cash with gloved hands. "His lungs are failing again. The shrapnel near his spine is causing rampant infections. This money keeps him breathing, but it doesn't fix the core issue. The surgical extraction will cost $50,000. If you don't get that money by the end of the month, he's not going to make it." "I will get it," Clara said fiercely, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. "I'm working for Santoro. He pays hazard wages. I'll scrub every drop of blood in that godforsaken house if I have to. I'll ask for another advance. Just keep him alive, William. Please." Dante's breath hitched in his throat. He slowly lowered his gun. He looked past Dr. Arris and Clara, toward the corner of the room. Lying in a rusted hospital bed was a young boy, no older than 12. He was hooked up to a labyrinth of tubes and a whirring ventilator. His frail body was motionless, paralyzed from the waist down. Dante stared at the boy's face, and a sudden, violent wave of nausea slammed into him. The weapon in his hand felt like lead. He knew that face. 3 years ago, in this exact neighborhood, Dante had ordered a devastating drive-by hit on the Romano Cruz stash house to eradicate their leadership. The hit had been a success, but his men had been sloppy. A stray fragmentation grenade had detonated near a passing civilian vehicle. Dante had read the police report. A mother and father were killed instantly. The sole survivor was a 9-year-old boy sitting in the back seat, critically wounded by shrapnel, whom the state had written off as permanent collateral damage. The boy in the bed was Toby Hayes. The realization hit Dante like a freight train, knocking the breath from his lungs. Clara wasn't an informant. She wasn't a rat. She was the older sister of the boy Dante's men had destroyed. She had infiltrated the household of the very monster who orphaned her, swallowed her grief, and scrubbed the blood of his enemies off his floors, all to take his bloody money and use it to keep her little brother alive. For the first time in his ruthless, violent life, Dante Santoro, the undisputed king of the Chicago underworld, was rendered entirely speechless. The silence in the subterranean clinic was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of Toby's ventilator. Dante Santoro, a man who had stared down rival cartels and corrupt federal prosecutors without blinking, stood paralyzed in the doorway. The suppressed H&K pistol, normally an extension of his own violent will, felt unnaturally heavy. He lowered it, the matte black barrel pointing toward the cracked linoleum floor. He stepped out of the shadows and into the harsh, glaring light of the surgical lamp. Clara gasped, a raw, jagged sound tearing from her throat. She spun around, her face draining of all color until she was as pale as the sterile gauze on Dr. Aris's tray. For a second, she couldn't process the impossibility of the scene. The devil himself was standing in a forgotten basement in Washington Park, dressed in a custom charcoal overcoat, holding a gun. Dr. Aris stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of scalpels that clattered loudly against the floor. He raised his gloved hands, his eyes wide with stark terror. "Santoro," the doctor breathed, recognizing the kingpin immediately. Everyone in the underground knew Dante's face. It was the last thing many of them saw. Clara didn't beg. She didn't drop to her knees or ask for mercy. The terrifying submissiveness she displayed at the Astor Street mansion vanished, replaced by the fierce primal instinct of a cornered animal protecting its young. She stepped directly into Dante's line of fire, throwing her arms out to shield Toby's frail, paralyzed body on the rusted bed. "Do it," Clara whispered, her voice trembling violently, but laced with absolute defiance. Tears streamed down her face, cutting through the grime of the city. "You took everything else from us. Just do it, Dante. But swear to me, swear on your soul, that you won't touch him. Kill me and leave the money for Dr. Aris. Just let Toby live." Dante stared at her, absorbing the crushing weight of her words. She knew. She had known all along who he was and what his orders had done to her family. For 6 months, she had polished the mahogany floors of the man who had ordered the hit that orphaned her. She had poured his bourbon. She had washed his blood-stained clothes. She had swallowed her hatred every single night, simply to siphon his wealth to keep her brother breathing. It was the most terrifying display of loyalty and strength Dante had ever witnessed. "Put your hands down, Clara," Dante said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, completely devoid of its usual commanding threat. He engaged the safety of his weapon with a quiet click and slid the gun smoothly back into his shoulder holster. He walked slowly into the center of the room. Clara flinched, but refused to step aside. Dante stopped inches away from her. Up close, he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the exhaustion carved into her youthful face. "I didn't know," Dante murmured, the admission feeling entirely foreign on his tongue. He never explained himself to anyone. "The Romano hit. They told me the civilian casualties were dead. They told me there was no one left." "They lied to you," Clara spat bitterly, her chest heaving. "Because your men didn't want to admit they botched the grenade toss. They blew up our car. My parents burned to death, and Toby took the shrapnel meant for your enemies. So I took your hazard pay. I earned every dirty penny of it." Dante looked over Clara's shoulder at the 12-year-old boy. The shrapnel near the spine. The failing lungs. A sudden, violent fury ignited in Dante's chest, not at Clara, but at his own men. At Leo Rossi, who had overseen the Romano strike. Dante pulled a sleek, encrypted satellite phone from his inner coat pocket. He dialed a number reserved for catastrophic emergencies. "What are you doing?" Dr. Aris stammered, inching toward the back exit. "Fixing a mistake," Dante replied coldly. The line connected. "Get Dr. Harrison Cross on the line. Tell him I need a fully equipped private trauma ICU set up at the penthouse suite in the St. Regis immediately. I need a stealth medical transport van at Washington Park. 10 minutes. Anyone who asks questions gets a bullet." He hung up and looked at Dr. Aris. "Pack him up. Disconnect the non-essential monitors." Clara's eyes widened in sheer panic. "No, you can't move him. His lungs will collapse. What are you doing with my brother?" Dante reached out, his large, calloused hands gently but firmly gripping Clara's trembling shoulders. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through both of them. "Clara, look at me," he commanded softly. "Look at me." She forced her tear-filled eyes to meet his piercing, dark gaze. "This basement is killing him," Dante said, his tone uncompromising but surprisingly gentle. "Dr. Aris is a butcher operating in a sewer. I am taking Toby to the best thoracic surgeon in the Western Hemisphere. He is going to extract the shrapnel. He is going to repair his lungs, and I am paying for all of it." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "Why would you do that?" "Because I broke him," Dante said, his voice thick with a dark, heavy remorse. "And because you had the courage to steal from the devil to put him back together. Nobody touches you from now on, Clara. Nobody." Within 12 minutes, the wail of sirens masked the arrival of a matte black medical transport van. Heavily armed paramilitaries in plain clothes secured the perimeter of the brownstone, while an elite medical extraction team stabilized Toby. Clara walked out of the basement, clutching Dante's tailored overcoat that he had draped over her freezing shoulders. As she watched Toby being loaded into the state-of-the-art mobile ICU, she realized her life as an invisible maid was over. She had just stepped into the center of Dante Santoro's terrifying world, and strangely, for the first time in 3 years, she felt entirely safe. The private medical suite at the top of the St. Regis was a fortress of glass, steel, and sterile white marble, offering a panoramic view of the glittering Chicago skyline. For the next 48 hours, Clara barely slept. She sat in a plush leather armchair beside Toby's state-of-the-art hospital bed, watching the steady rhythm of his heart monitor. Dr. Harrison Cross had performed a grueling 8-hour spinal surgery. The shrapnel was gone. The lung tissue was repaired. Toby was sedated, but for the first time in years, he was breathing on his own without a mechanical ventilator. Dante never left the penthouse. He moved his entire command center to the adjoining living room. Clara would occasionally glance through the glass partition, watching the terrifying mob boss conduct his ruthless business in hushed tones, surrounded by bodyguards. Yet every time she looked up, she found Dante's dark eyes already fixed on her, heavy with an intense, burning protectiveness that made her breath hitch. The dynamic between them had irrevocably shifted. The paralyzing fear Clara once harbored had dissolved, replaced by a complex, magnetic tension. Dante brought her meals himself. He forced her to rest. He touched her arm with a reverence reserved for fragile, precious things, a stark contrast to the violence he wielded against his enemies. But a storm was brewing beneath the surface of Dante's empire, and its name was Leo Rossi. Leo was Dante's underboss, the man who handled the payroll, the man who handed Clara her cash every Friday, and crucially, the man who had personally thrown the fragmentation grenade that destroyed Clara's family 3 years ago. When Leo discovered that Dante had vanished from the Astor Street estate and relocated to the St. Regis to guard a random night maid and a crippled boy, his survival instinct kicked in. Leo ran the background check he should have run 6 months ago. He connected the dots. If Dante realized Leo was directly responsible for lying about the civilian casualties, Dante would strip the flesh from his bones. Leo knew the only way to survive was to eliminate the evidence. The boy and the girl had to die, and it had to look like a medical complication. On the third night, a rare, torrential thunderstorm battered the city. Dante had briefly stepped onto the private helipad on the roof to handle an encrypted call regarding a shipment at the docks, leaving the suite guarded by 2 men at the front door. Leo used his security clearance to bypass the lobby. He arrived at the penthouse via the private service elevator, slipping a lethal dose of potassium chloride into a syringe. He bypassed the guards under the guise of an emergency briefing and stepped into the dim, quiet ICU suite. Clara was asleep in the armchair, her head resting on the edge of Toby's mattress. Leo moved silently toward the IV line. He uncapped the syringe, his eyes cold and devoid of mercy. Suddenly, a massive hand clamped around Leo's wrist with the crushing force of a steel vice. Leo gasped, dropping the syringe as the bones in his arm cracked under the pressure. He was violently yanked backward, thrown across the room until his back slammed brutally against the reinforced glass window. Dante stood in the shadows, his eyes black with a murderous, unholy rage. "Did you really think I wouldn't check the perimeter logs, Leo?" Dante hissed, his voice dropping to a terrifying, guttural register. "Did you think I wouldn't figure out who threw the grenade?" Clara jolted awake at the sound of the scuffle, screaming as she saw Leo cornered by Dante. "Dante, listen to me," Leo pleaded, spitting blood as Dante's forearm pinned his throat against the glass. "She's a liability. She infiltrated us. You're going soft for a maid who's going to turn state's evidence the second the feds offer her witness protection. I did what had to be done for the family." "She is my family now," Dante snarled. Without a moment of hesitation, Dante drew a custom obsidian black combat knife from his belt. He didn't use a gun. He wouldn't risk waking the boy or terrifying Clara with the gunshot. With ruthless, practiced precision, Dante drove the blade directly into Leo's chest, piercing his heart instantly. Leo's eyes rolled back, and Dante lowered his lifeless body quietly to the floor, stepping over the spreading pool of crimson. Clara stood frozen by the bed, trembling as she stared at the dead underboss. She looked up at Dante. His hands were stained with blood. He was a monster, a king of a dark and violent underworld. But as he looked at her, dropping the knife and stepping carefully over the blood so he wouldn't track it near her brother, she saw the absolute devotion in his eyes. Dante walked over to Clara, gently cupping her pale face in his large, blood-speckled hands. "He will never hurt you again," Dante whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "Nobody will. Your debts are wiped. Your brother is safe. You will never have to scrub another floor in the dark as long as I have breath in my lungs." Clara leaned into his touch, the terror finally melting away into a profound, overwhelming surrender. She grabbed the lapels of his suit, pulling him closer, closing the distance between the invisible maid and the Mafia king. As his lips met hers in a fierce, desperate kiss, Clara knew she was no longer hiding from the darkness. She was standing beside the man who ruled it. Did this dark, twisted Mafia romance keep you on the edge of your seat? From a desperate maid hiding a tragic secret to a ruthless mob boss who would burn his own empire down to protect her, Dante and Clara's story proves that sometimes the most dangerous men love the hardest. If you loved this intense story of betrayal, sacrifice, and dangerous romance, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling stories.